I wanted to have an idea what the data I've got actually tells me, and it kind of started really with a thing that's been niggling me for a while, which is the status of mottled grasshopper in Kent. This is one here in the tube. And mottled grasshopper, for people that don't know, it's a small but quite distinctive grasshopper, but it's one I've only rarely seen in Kent. Although that, I mean, to a large extent, that's because I'm not doing surveys in the kind of places that I knew it occurred. But the fact that you have to go to the places where it's known to occur to find it in Kent is significant in itself, because actually nationwide, it's one of the most widespread grasshoppers in Britain, in all four corners of the island, lots of places in between, and it's even out, as you can see on this map, is out on the Hebridean Islands. So it's a very, very widespread insect in a range of habitats over a range of different climates, which means you would think in the southeast corner it ought to be pretty widespread and easy to find, but it isn't. So to think a little bit about this, I went back to the database, and I've got, because I'm the recorder, I've got a database which I hold in MapMate at the minute, which has a lot of records. Actually, it has over 13,000 records on it, and I pulled out my records for mottled grasshopper, and you can see that it's actually, from the records I've got, pretty sparse in Kent, concentrated really around Sandwich Bay and down on Dungeness, with a few scattered inland locations. I went back to look at some other old maps. So Marshall and Hayes, that people may know, big, for many years, definitive book on the Orthoptera in Britain, has distribution maps in it, and actually these don't quite match up with the data I've got. So on there, I've blown up a little bit of their map for mottled grasshopper, and what you can see is a lot of dots. The closed dots are 1961 onwards, the open dots are pre-1961, and it doesn't quite match up. Even if you sort of turn my records into hectads. So if I go back to that map again, which is based on tetrad records, turn those into 10k square hectares, and those are the dots which I would have. Now, of the dots I've got, there are two there in green which are not in Marshall and Hayes' book, but they have these three additional in yellow pre-1961 records, the locations for the insect, and those 4 hectads are in their book as post or 1961 onwards. So they've got a lot more records really overall than much more widely distributed, widespread insect in their book than it appears to be now. So I was wondering what has really happened to it. Is it really as scarce and localized as it appears to be from the records I've got? Is it becoming more localized? Are these losses, apparent losses on these maps, actually real? So I started having a poke around the data, and one thing I wanted to look at was what records I had and how many records I had, and I'd say it's 13. Well, I've read it at the moment, 13,139 records for Orthoptera, although actually there's a few duplicates in there. But that's all the crickets, the bush crickets, groundhoppers, grasshoppers. And that includes records I've been sent as county recorder for Field Club, it is also all the data which I transcribed from the cards in Moyse Museum, and data which has been provided by Kent and Medway Biological Records Centre very kindly. And I also tend to go into iRecord and glean records from there as well to add them in, because increasingly you notice that records go straight to things like iRecord rather than coming through sort of field club recording. And you can see if you put those, the number of records per year, they kind of increased over time, ups and downs, but really most of my records are from 1970 onwards. And because it goes up and down so much, you can't really do year-on-year comparison. So hence my 5 decades, I actually chose to group the data together by decade over the last 50 years up to 2020, to see if that would show any trends in terms of distribution or trends of numbers. So I've mapped, if you map by decade for mottled grasshopper to see how the distribution might have changed, actually really what you're showing is where people happen to have gone in those 10-year periods and look. So you know, to the 70s, the 80s, 90s, the 2000s. Oh, yes, there's one in the 2000s. It's interesting how much they change every year. But I mean, there's a few down there, but obviously in the 80s, we go back to there. No one sent any records in from Sandwich Bay, but people got some inland records. And then the 90s, no one's looked at inland records. In the 2010s, people are back out at Sandwich and Dungeness. There's one in the west. That's Hayes Common in the extreme west of the county, in what is now Greater London, but is the Watsonian Kent, is Vice County 16, West Kent. I'm quite sparse for records of the Greater London area because I haven't, and I should do, chase London Natural Society or the Record Centre in London to see what records I can get. That one is a Hayes Common record of Gran Hemington sent in, but it's a bit of an outlier for West Kent for the reasons I explained. And 2010s back to the coast. One of the things that you do notice if you flick back to the 2000s and the 1990s is that it's since the 1980s there haven't been any inland records from mottled grasshopper. They're all coastal, and that made me wonder whether that meant that the insects had actually gone from inland sites or not. So last summer, with a bit more time to hand, I went and had a look at some of the old sites, inland sites that I had. And for 2020 and 2021, these are the records for mottled grasshopper I got. The 2 dots at Sandwich Bay are other people's, but the 3 others, Dungeness, and the 2 other dots are records that I made in 2021. Give you some background on those. That one there is Hatch Park, which is a privately owned deer park, triple SI near Ashford, Merstham. And that one, its last record, or most recent record until last year, was 1979 mottled grasshopper. And then that one is Coolham Pits, which the last record previous to last year was 1984. So they're still in these places. This is a female mottled grasshopper photographed at Hatch Park. And actually, despite the fact that there have been no records since 1979, they're actually fairly easy to find here in the suitable habitat. mottled grasshopper is very much a short, open grassland insect. So it needs this kind of very sparse, open, short grassland with a lot of coarse grasses and plenty of sunshine. Once I got onto that bit of habitat at Hatch Park, there were a number of individuals they were not hard to find at all. Contrasting, Bowen Down in the Coolham pit, where it last recorded in '84, it was actually quite hard. Around the bottom of this pit here, I spent an hour or more scouring the place in what appeared to be good enough weather conditions. Eventually finding one individual, this is a male, with the typical features that they have. You see the antennae are clubbed at the tip and sort of outturned at the tip, which is quite typical of well, a nice, easy, distinctive characteristic for mottled grasshopper. So eventually managed to find them there. Just spotting there's some chat coming up. When I come to a break, I'll have a look at those if that's okay with people. That's those two. Hothfield, where there were records. So the most recent record I had on the database was 1986. Try as I might, I could not find mottled grasshopper there. And in fact, it's a site that I've been back to quite a few times over the last few years, not being too far from where we live. And I've never had success in finding mottled grasshopper either by ear or by eye. Despite the fact there does appear to be suitable habitat there. I think what's happening with this insect is that it's making me do that. The site may be suitable now, but it appears to have gone through a period when it wasn't particularly suitable. So I took these plans of the site from the paper which Ian Rickards kept I trusted for previous volume of field club transactions when we focused on heathland. And these plans show that you've got a gradual change in build-up in the woody cover on the site over the years. In 1982, you got the last record in '86. By 1992, the site was probably around about its peak of woodland cover. And then it was gradually cleared again. The trust put a lot of effort into opening the area up, getting the grazing right, getting a lot of tree cover down. So you've got a site which has got lots of apparently suitable habitat, nice short grass, nice open sunny conditions, and yet the insect's not there. And I think what may have happened, as I say, the population shrunk so small that it couldn't survive when the site was heavily wooded. Perhaps grazing was far less intensive, and it just hasn't been able to recolonize. It's a species that is considered quite sedentary, so even though Hatch Park is only about 7 miles away, the crow flies, they don't appear to have made their way back. Another site I did find, failed to find the insect was Lyddon Temple Ewel. So I've looked at chalky and heathy habitats, but Lyddon Temple Ewel on the chalk downland used to be very good for it. In Marshall and Hayes, they say, which is listed in lists Lyddon Temple Ewel Reserve as one of the outstanding sites for Orthoptera. They note that it's mottled grasshopper is very common in short turf there. They talk about it having closely cattle grazed down the turf on the side. However, going back this year, that doesn't appear to be the case. It's lovely and flower rich, but it's relatively tall. And spending a couple of best part of a couple of days, certainly a couple of big afternoons at Lyddon this year, it was very, very difficult to find any short open turf, and there are, again, no signs of mottled grasshopper there at all, even in currently suitable web conditions. So it's gone from a few sites. Does this reflect a broader decline? Hard to say, but I went back to the records and tried to get an idea of relative change by breaking down all the records per decade by species proportionally. So in each of these, you've got columns from left to right, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s. And each of the different coloured bars represents the proportion of all the Orthoptera records in that decade represented by a particular species, which are keyed on the right. And these, the mottled grasshoppers, are the green ones at the top. And it does appear, when you look at all tetrads, that there may be that's a decline. In fact, take out the sites take out the sites where we know it's gone, just use the sites we know it's actually at. And the proportion of records is about the same. So this suggests if you take it that it shows up, a species shows up as a record in proportionally to its frequency in the total Orthoptera population, which I admit is not foolproof, but it's the best we can do to assume that if people are going to places and they're recording Orthoptera, then the records are proportional to the frequency of the species they're finding. It suggests that maybe it's doing okay still on the places where it occurs, but if there's any loss of mottled grasshopper, it's lost from sites rather than a sort of general declining frequency on the sites where it does occur. I admit this is a rather possibly quite a difficult conclusion to make from the data. There's some interesting other things you start to notice if you look at all these different coloured stripes and you poke about in them. And one of them is what's happening to coneheads. And what's interesting is you've got these dirty green coloured blocks here. This is short-winged conehead numbers, and then these grey blocks are long-winged conehead, which appeared in Kent in the 1990s for the first time, expanded very rapidly. And what appears to be happening, initially this is data specifically drawn out from mottled grasshopper, but you start saying, hang on, where are the where are the short-winged coneheads going? If you look at the whole, all the data for the county to see if that's, reflects it, well, actually there's the short-winged conehead proportion, the total number of, the proportion of all records that are short-winged coneheads for each decade, and there are the proportion of records that are long-winged coneheads for each decade, and it starts to look as if one is replacing the other. If you drill down into this data a bit and you just look at those tetrads, those 2 km squares where short-winged coneheads have been recorded sometime in the last 5 decades, and you see what proportion of all those records, all the Orthoptera records for those tetrads are long-winged or short-winged conehead, this is what you see. Short-winged conehead there shows in those orange bars a very steep decline in the 80s onwards. The long-winged conehead appears in the 90s and shows quite a steep increase, which is interesting because it was something that I kind of felt looking at sites that actually short-winged coneheads were getting harder to find in the places where I expected to find them. Purely an impression, no data, no notes to back that up. But it's interesting that it seems to be typical of all the records that short-winged coneheads are appearing less and less in the data people are collecting. Are they disappearing? Have they got a range contraction? Have a look at that. I plotted tetrad distribution of short-winged conehead by decade, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s and 2010s. The records sort of change decade by decade, but pretty much the range looks more or less the same, even if the total number of records within that range is smaller. So it looks like it's not necessarily really just a range contraction. And it could just be that they're getting less common in the places they occur. My impression, I don't know if it's shared by anybody else, but my impression is that they're increasingly confined to the wet parts of the places they occur. So short-winged coneheads are wetland specialists. You get them on coastal sites, riverside, riverine sites, grazing marsh. They're where they are around very wet vegetation, but previously they seem to spread out more into drier, tall, grassy vegetation close to wetlands. So you find them on, say, long grass in the sea walls. Again, this is not, I don't have notes of this, this is just my memory of the long. So does this mean their habitats are getting drier, maybe, which is forcing them to use just the very wettest parts of these habitats? Or does it mean that long-winged coneheads have a competitive advantage in the drier places, and short-winged coneheads are therefore pushed into the wetter places where they do better than the long-winged coneheads? I do wonder if there's some competition going on. Something that's hard to explore in Kent, where long-winged conehead is now everywhere, but I wonder whether some studies on beyond the edge of the long-winged conehead range might throw some light. Another way to throw some light on that, perhaps, is to look at other wetland specialist grasshoppers. I might have a quick look at the chat. Yes, indeed. Just have a look at some of these bits of chat. Okay, the Hayes Con record. Oh, excellent. Definitely 2021. Thank you, Grant. A lot of parallels. Good question there from Sarah. Does parallels? I don't know. You have a look, Sarah. These next graphs I'm going to show. We'll see if it's unrecorded. Yeah. Yes. Interesting comments by people there. This is another wetland species. I say this is lesser marsh grasshopper. So it's another grasshopper associated with wetland habitats, weather coastal habitats, riverine habitats. Although it is found sometimes in dry habitats, found it up in the Blean. You find it in some odd places that you don't expect to, but as you can see from this map, the bulk of its distribution is coast and along river valley. Generally, it's in grassy spaces, grassy places, and it lives alongside species like meadow grasshopper and field grasshopper. But if you look at the tetrads where this occurs, where lesser marsh grasshopper has been recorded, and you look at the proportion of records in those tetrads which are lesser marsh grasshopper, I'm not claiming any statistical validity for that trend line. It's really just to show what Excel makes of the figures, but you've got what looks like a pretty sharp decline in the last 2 or 3 decades in lesser marsh grasshopper numbers. At the same time, meadow grasshopper has increased reasonably substantially, and field grasshopper seems to have maybe increased a bit. It's fairly level, which is interesting because field grasshopper is a species of more open, shorter, drier grassland, kind of open habitat structure that probably a lesser marsh grasshopper would like. So it suggests that the habitat structure is probably right, but meadow grasshopper, while it will use damper grasslands, actually is quite happy in dry grasslands and seems to be doing better, increasingly well, in the kind of places where lesser marsh grasshopper used to occur. So if another piece of evidence suggests maybe what we've got is a drying out of suitable habitats, which means that meadow grasshopper is better able to use them and lesser marsh grasshopper less able to make use of those habitats. I must say, with that Sarah's comment about people not noticing meadow grasshopper because it's so frequent, I'm wondering whether I was wondering in looking at these data whether it's the opposite, whether you've got people who were maybe more generalist recorders going out, recording a lot more the species that were widespread and easy to recognise, like meadow grasshopper, rather than perhaps a species you have to look at more closely, and whether that was a factor that was skewing the data. Impossible to say, I think, on this, on what we've got. One more species to look at, we suggest there other factors, maybe striped-winged grasshopper. So this is a bit like short-winged conehead and lesser marsh grasshopper. This is one of those species which seems to me to be harder to find than it used to be. Go to places that you think of this like great striped-winged grasshopper site, or go to downland sites because it's a downland insect, and it was getting more and more difficult to find, or seemingly in my head that appeared to be the case. So I thought it was another one worth looking at. The striped-winged grasshopper, which are rather smart insects, they are a species of short, open, dry grassland, which means on downland sites, they're in the more sparse or the more closely grayed bits of grassland. Is their distribution of dots that I have for them. You can see that they, apart from a few extraneous ones, they're pretty much following the line of downs, north downs to Kent. They're often found alongside this little bee. See, this is rufous grasshopper. So another species with clubbed antennae, the other one. But as you can see, the difference with mottled grasshopper, the clubs are not outturned on this, and also there's a nice prominent white tip to the clubs on rufous grasshopper, which means it's pretty easy to distinguish from mottled grasshopper. So rufous grasshopper, another downland specialist, actually less common than striped-winged generally. But they occupy a different niche on downland. They're in taller, rougher bits of sward, with the striped-wings in the shorter grass. So, for instance, you've got the bits that Ranscombe, they mown grass that's cut once a year and gets sort of a couple of feet high and quite dense, has rufous grasshopper, but will be totally unsuitable to striped-wing. Places like Queendown, quite noticeable that you would get striped-wing on a very short, close grey sward. But if you went to the edges of the site, around the edges of the scrub where the grass was 18 inches tall or something, then you would find rufous grasshopper in that habitat. So they're quite different from where they occur. If we look at all those tetrads where striped-winged grasshopper has been found, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s and 2010s, you can see a pretty substantial decline showed by that trend line in their presence within the records. They've gone from more than 10% of records to well less than 5% more records for those tetrads. At the same time, meadow grasshopper in yellow has gone up, while rufous grasshopper, which is the green block, seems to be fairly steady, which I think is interesting, because what this is saying is that you've got a species that likes short open sward declining. You've got meadow grasshopper, which likes, very happy, much taller grass and increasing. But the rufous grasshopper, again a tall grass specialist, is staying about the same. We suggest you're not losing sight, particularly down the sites, but those down sites may well be changing. The swarding and may be longer, perhaps because of changing management, perhaps because of things like nitrogen deposition, and that may be reducing the amount of habitat for that species. Which kind of ties in a little bit with what seems to have happened at least at Liddy for mottled grasshopper. You've got a management change, which is changing what the species composition on those sites is. So this also takes me back to my title, which was about jumping to conclusions, because the data is very coarse. And it's quite hard to work out exactly what's going on. When you look at these ones for striped-winged grasshopper records, this is striped-winged grasshopper in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s and 2010s, showing the distribution of tetrad records. And they come and go, as they often do, depending on where people have gone in that particular 10 years. But if you look at that 10K square that I've outlined in red in each of those maps, that's the cliff tops around Dover and to the north of Dover. And you can see there's an awful lot of records in the 70s and 80s, and then none for 3 decades. And that made me think about whether, okay, is that what skewed the figures? Is it a case that no one has been to look at those particular tetrads? And because no one's been to look for those tetrads for Orthoptera, maybe that skewed all the data and it looks like it's a declining insect. Well, actually, if you look at the total number of visits that resulted in Orthoptera records in that particular hectare, TRP4, they've actually gone up. The 90s they were highest, but the 70s, when there were so many records, there were only 9 visits to use those records, 17 in the 80s, but so it's not that the recording effort is lost for Orthoptera. But then if you look even more closely at the records, in fact, you see that all those dots in the 70s and 80s in that red outline square were by one single recorder. That was Chris Hayes, who co-authored the grasshopper phenolide insect book. So is it that recorders coming later are not as capable? Well, I've looked at the names on it of the people who recorded in that square since then, and know there are plenty of people who've been in that square who would be able to recognise striped-winged grasshopper. It could be that when Chris Hayes went, he was going specifically with the intent in the 70s and 80s, probably with the book in mind, of recording Orthoptera. So was actually putting the effort into find as many species as he could in those decades. The only final clue is that he actually came back to Dover in 2000. So there are a number of records in that square. In 2000, he only went to 2 tetrads in his 2000 visit, rather than the 10 he went to in 1973 and the 5 in 1988. He's obviously Moyse dog. but both the texts he went to, he had previously found striking grasshopper, and he did not clearly find it in 2000, despite finding 7 other species. So I think what we've got from this data, there, I think you can probably tentatively at least say there have been changes in what has happened to Orthoptera, and those changes may have to do with climate, but also there are changes in habitat management that are particularly chalk grass, which are leaving the habitat longer, the sward longer, and that's having an impact on Orthoptera. That does tie into what some botanical studies have found, which is you look at big surveys such as done by the BSBI that in generally vegetation is getting taller and shadier, to do with management, but also to do with things like nitrogen deposition, leading to more fertile soils. And that habitats are becoming drier, the plants are showing it as well. What this possibly indicates, the data I've got here, is that those changes are affecting the Orthoptera. If they're affecting the Orthoptera, they're affecting an awful lot of other invertebrates at the same time. Below the title suggests that it really is jumping to some tenuous conclusions. Really the only answer, I think, for me and others is to get out there and do some more field work and see if what the data suggests is really true. Thank you.